Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Paranormal Palaver, where we interview the experts in the paranormal and the experiencers thereof. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this week's edition of the Paranormal Palaver. I had some questions here lately about what's the etymology of that. Well, that comes from the Portuguese. That word in Portuguese is derived from the Greek word parable. So literally speaking, this is the paranormal parable. So we took a second look at Fatima, Brian and I did quite some time back, and we completely dropped the ball. To be honest with you, neither Brian or I knew that LA was knee-deep in working on this topic. And it's absolutely off the charts what he has found. He has found multiple sources that is completely original in English. So if you've studied Fatima and you think you know all about Fatima, I assure you, you do not until after you watch this documentary, Fatima 2. Now, LA has provided us with a special just for our listeners, and we're going to let him describe that. And he's let me know that we can use that at our discretion, so that's pretty exciting for all of our listeners. So, LA needs no introduction. Prolific writer, author, authority in all things paranormal as it pertains to the Bible. No doubt about that. He's been our good friend for 8 or 9 years, so we're working well in a decade. He and his wife is quite a blessing. They continue to push forward. He continues to travel. He goes overseas. He goes out of his way to do the absolute best job he can for the bride to get her ready for what is to come. So with that in mind, L.A., why don't you tell us why you even decided to approach this topic of Fatima? I thought everything was water underneath the bridge. I thought that everybody knew everything there was to know about Fatima. So let's start there.
Sure. Well, first of all, Matthew and Brian, thanks so much for having me back on Paranormal Palaver. Always good to be here, and my second stint with you guys, and looking for more in the future. But what happened was about a year ago, actually a little over a year ago, I was working on a film which is still on the drawing board. In fact, we're starting pre-production on it again. It'll be released in 2019. It's from the Watchmen Chronicles. And all these films I do, they're under the banner, the Watchmen Chronicles. That's the overarching banner. The Watchmen Chronicles presents Fatima 1. The Watchmen Chronicles presents Fatima 2. So I was working on a film called Angels and Demons, and I had a lot of interviews already, probably a couple of hours worth of interviews from people who had encounters with the angelic or the demonic. So again, that will be coming out in 2019, and we're very excited by that. But I was in my bedroom. We were getting ready to go to church, and the Holy Spirit just kind of tapped me on the shoulder and gave me one word. Now, this is in 2017, probably around April, and he said, Fatima. And I just went, and I started thinking about it. And as I was thinking about it, I realized, oh my gosh, it's 2017. It's a 100-year anniversary of the so-called miracle of the sun. I walk into where my wife was, and I said, honey, we're going to Portugal. And she looked at me like, what? And I go, yeah, that's the next film. We're working on Fatima. So we got over to Portugal. We spent 2 weeks there. Our guide, an incredible guide, Francisco Correia, basically had lined up a whole retinue of speakers, the least of which was Joaquim Fernandez. And I should say, he was like Joaquim Fernandez and Fina de Armada's book on Fatima, Celestial Lights, written, a while back, really is what put this on the map for me. And I wrote about it in a book which was published about 10 years ago called Politics, Prophecy, and the Supernatural. There's a whole chapter on Fatima. Tom Horn and Chris Putman used that chapter on Fatima for their book, Exo Vaticana. And what I discovered was when we got over there and we started talking to people like Joaquim Fernandez, which, he's been studying this for decades. But we talk to experts, we talk to historians, we talk to philosophers, we talk to anthropologists. I mean, everybody we talked to basically had a PhD after their name. These are highly educated men and one woman, and her name was Frederica Claro de Armada. She's Fina de Armada's daughter. And everyone was just incredible. And actually, Frederica is studying for her PhD. She'll probably get it this year. So everyone's highly educated and looked at the apparitions that happened at Fatima, basically 101 years ago now, and wrote about it. So here I am, immersed in all these experts, and I had, I'd done my homework. I had read all of Fina de Armada's and Joaquim Fernandez's work, and scoured the internet for other stories and read up on it. So I mean, I thought I was prepared until I got there, which is often the case. We can read up about things, but when you're in the midst of the fray, as it were, everything takes on a new meaning, and that's what Fatima was. When we got to Fatima, we got there at night, and I told our driver and our guide and friend Francisco, I said, look, I want to get there around 8 o'clock at night when the crowds are gone, in the cool of the evening. It'll be great for photography. So that's what happened. We got there. There was maybe less than 500 people. And you got to remember that this sanctuary of Fatima can hold upwards of 1 million people at a time. It's huge. It's absolutely ginormous. It's very, very large, the plaza. The cathedral's up on, above it, and the plaza and where the tree was is what the site of the chapel. And I mean, all that, and it's dialed in. I mean, this thing is set up as a shrine, as a sanctuary, and it's dialed in. I mean, it's really dialed in. So when you go there, there's like sacred music. And what I mean by that, sacred music was written during the Middle Ages or during the Renaissance, whatever. But it's not rock and roll. It's not some kid with a guitar doing 4 chords and saying Jesus loves me. It's sacred music. It's choral music. It's symphonic, it's orchestral, it's wafting. They have speakers all over the place, but it's very low and it sets up the mood. So we got there at 8 o'clock, and I'm just blown away by the whole place. I mean, it's really, really dialed in. But remember, I mean, just because there's a sanctuary like that, or just because the Vatican has a huge edifice, or you go to St. John's Cathedral, it doesn't necessarily mean that the Spirit of the living God is dwelling in those places. I was just at St. John's Cathedral several months ago in New York City. We actually did a quick PPS report on it and posted it on my YouTube channel, LA Marzulli. And, if the Holy Spirit was in that place, then I'm a monkey's uncle, with all due respect. I mean, it was a very large, very ginormous cathedral, if I keep using that word, but it was void of anything that I felt. I mean, I didn't feel the presence of the Lord in there at all. Just one big, dark, cold, grandiose cathedral built by the Masons. But I digress. So we get over there, and the next day we go back, and it's July 13th, which is one of the feast days. So let me give you the backstory so your audience understands. In 1917, World War I was raging. Okay? All of Europe was in the throes of World War I. Trench warfare had been going on for years. People were very concerned about loved ones. The body count was in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions. It was a real mess. It was bogged down in trench warfare. Airplanes were not being used really in aerial combat. They were used more for reconnaissance, although they were just starting to mess with dropping grenades or bombs. So the aircraft was just kind of making its way into warfare. In Portugal, there were no airplanes, and most people in Portugal had never seen any type of aerial phenomenon at all. End of story, period. So during this time, in 1917, World War I is raging, and at the same time, the Bolshevik Revolution is happening in Russia, which topples the Tsar and creates the threat of the communist revolution all throughout Europe. Remember, when the Bolsheviks took power, there were cells all throughout the countries in Europe. And what bothered everyone was the fact that royalty, obviously the Tsar, was outed, and the people came in and took power. And of course, we all know what happened. The communist rule didn't work over 70 million people died in the prison camps and the gulags. And the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, collapsed at its own weight. It doesn't work. Socialism doesn't work, and communism is just a few steps away from socialism, only more so. And it doesn't work, and it never will. And that's what the former Soviet Union, after decades of it, 70 years of it, they finally dismantled the former Soviet Union under Gorbachev. Ronald Reagan, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And so that's going on. And at the same time, you've got World War I, the Communist Revolution happening. In the halls of power in England, they're drawing up the declaration, the Balfour Declaration, which will give Israel a right to return to the land. So all three things are happening simultaneously. Enter a group of mediums, spiritualists, people who delve into the occult. They are meeting in Portugal. They are using a technique called automatic writing, which, by the way, we are forbidden to do. Automatic writing is when people go into a trance and you allow an entity to partially possess you, take control of your hand, and automatic writing begins to happen. Helena Blavatsky, in some ways, she could be considered the mother of what we have today, the New Age movement, wrote all of her books through that technique, automatic writing. She would go into a room, and 2 days later, staying up 24 hours a day, she would appear with a voluminous work, often 500-600 pages, all written by automatic writing. So she's in a trance, and this entity is taking over her and writing. Well, that's exactly what happened in Portugal in 1917. These group of mediums got together, and they, through the technique, the occult technique of automatic writing, had a message, and it said this, that something wondrous was going to happen throughout Portugal, that all of Portugal would be amazed by it. Something wondrous would happen on May 13th, 1917. So this group of medium publishes this announcement in a paper, one of the major papers in Portugal. Another group of mediums are meeting, and they get the same message, and they publish their message in the paper. The message is signed Stella Matutina, the bright morning star. For Christians, for evangelicals, that ties back into Lucifer, the angel of light. That's who we think it is. And so it's 1917. In the village of Fatima, there are three children, Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta. They're very, very young. Lucia is like 10 or 11. Francisco's 9. Jacinta's 7. Okay? Very, very young, impressionable children. They are illiterate. They cannot read or write. They do not go to school. They go to church, and they listen to stories from the Bible. That's all they know. And the stories that are passed around fires in the winter. That's it. They're completely illiterate. They are tending sheep when an entity appears to them above a tree, and the entity communicates with the children telepathically, voice to brain, voice to skull. So the entity's not moving its lips. It's communicating with them telepathically. It then gives the children something to eat and drink. Lucia and Jacinta and Francisco all eat, but only Lucia and Jacinta drink. Francisco does not drink. So only Lucia and Jacinta can hear what this female entity is saying. Francisco sees the entity, but never hears her. The entity is dressed strangely. She's got this cloak around her, and she's wearing a short skirt which falls right below the knee. This is very troubling in 1917, and in my opinion has nothing to do with Mary or the Bible. So let's stop for a second. In Fatima 1, in the very beginning of the film, I state that that people who go to Fatima, in other words, millions of people go to Fatima every year. Millions of Muslims encircle the Kaaba stone in Mecca. Millions of Hindus celebrate at Guru Puja. Millions of Buddhists worship at thousands of temples all over Asia. So we're not disparaging anyone's belief system in any way. And we're not going to attack Mary or the Bible or who people think this thing was. We're just not going to do this. And we didn't. And we don't in the film. We do not do this. So what we do in the film is we drill in on what happened. And that's what the film is really about. And what we discovered there was a completely different narrative than basically in the official story.
Well, L.A., you mentioned someone else's work. They had produced a book on this particular incident, and that is, as we shall say, extremely lacking. The first thing you did was you got boots on the ground. You got to the site. You wanted to hear what these people had to say. I mean, this happened in Portugal. Where else would you go? And that was the first thing that shocked me, was that L.A. got boots on the ground, and he immediately comes up with something that I'd never heard before. Now, wait a minute. This is obviously and overtly got something to do with women. Why didn't the little boy, why wasn't he able to hear? It lends credence to the simple fact that this is really the worship of the feminine. That's what it seems like to me. Now, what is really startling to me in this documentary is L.A. is not just talking. He literally shows on camera the signature of this entity. And I want to ask Brian about that particular entity and this time frame of World War I, this upheaval. Brian, what can you tell the listeners after further research on this entity? Is this got something to do with the worship of the feminine, or are we looking at something else? What's your conclusions in a thumbnail sketch, please?
Well, most certainly it has a whole lot to do with that worship of the feminine. And, some of the stuff I've been looking through here the last couple of days, I actually stumbled onto a reference as to when modern day witchcraft and goddess worship had really got rolling, which was actually in 1899, it's this infamous time span that we keep coming back to when we've been looking at work over the course of the last 120 years. And lo and behold, you have this reference. Now, on top of it, that name, Stella Matutina, you end up finding out is a breakaway group from the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, who are they essentially? Well, they were a breakaway group from the Freemasons that started going down quite a few other occult ventures, basically in the midst of the late 1800s into the early 1900s. And this group broke away after a revolt of the London adepts against the then head of the order, Samuel MacGregor Mathers. In the early 1900s, the order is segmented into two groups. Those who remained loyal to Mathers took on the name Alpha et Omega, while the London group took on the name the Hermetic Society of the Mugganaroth. The latter group retained such members as Robert Falcon, a British doctor, and John William Brodie, N. A.E. Waite, Rev. Ayton, W.B. Yeats, and others. And essentially, as things go on down the line here, you find out that they end up getting connected in with the same style of using mediumship with the automatic writing with the trance states, which on top of it, they end up finding themselves connected to Ordo Templi Orientis at an early stage as well, which seems to be bringing us back full circle to a very major factor that we see coming up time and time and time again as we look at everything connected into the modern UFO outbreaks within at least from 1947 and forward. This group, this name, all of this keeps tying into one great big circle, and you can't escape it.
Well, Brian, I'm sorry to insult both of our intelligences. It obviously did escape us until L.A. Marzulli put this information together, because we looked at this before, and I'm just, at first I was frustrated, Brian. How on earth did we drop the ball that this particular group that calls themselves after this entity, their expertise is astral projection. So that tying into the midst, you realize that they very well could have been astral projecting and producing the automatic writing that L.A. documented. Do you think that is a possibility, Brian? And then we'll get back to L.A.
Well, I would have to state that it's deeply connected. And I mean, even the work I've been looking at, some other odds and ends here concerning some of the occult groups that were locked in, which went down later through history with the Thule Society and all of that. You find out there's another group of mediums in 1917 as well that started having these same experiences in contact with these same type of entities. It seems to keep going back in this circle. And it's getting to the point now I've been starting to notice something is connected into this reemergence of this goddess worship that is so deeply embedded into the entire fabric of everything that's been going on as far as this modern emergence of UFOs as well.
L.A., you need to comment on this. I just find it absolutely amazing that Brian and I have literally studied this to wit's end, and yet you bring forward some things that are absolutely groundbreaking. You have broke ground here, L.A. You have managed to tie in this worship of this goddess. It's Advent. Brian clearly told us that the history points to the event horizon being this time frame that you just described, and I find that to be completely uncalled for. I've researched this, and yet you're the one that spilt the beans. Did you find any other connections? I mean, is this place in Portugal special? Or, L.A., did you go to other locations that have similar occurrences? Can you please speak to that?
First of all, we went to other, there are sites all over Portugal, ancient goddess worship. And see, let me tell you something. Let me give you the backstory. So, I'm very familiar with spiritual warfare. And, like when we go to conferences and stuff, sometimes the warfare can really ramp up. When we go to certain places, let's say like the Serpent Mound of a Newark Great Circle and Octagon Mound in Ohio, warfare can ramp up. Down in Peru, warfare can ramp up. I've never experienced anything like I experienced when I got into Fatima. The warfare was off the hook. I mean, visceral, to the point where at 3 a.m. in the morning, I'm laying in the bed, tucked in a fetal position, and begging and telling the Lord, I'm leaving in the morning. I can't stay here. I can't. There's no way. Whatever's here is way bigger than I am. It's like a principality which has never been deposed. And I just said, I can't do this. And basically, going through my head was every type of unwanted thought you can possibly imagine. Every perverted sexual thing. You say, well, why would the Lord show you that, LA? Well, the Lord's not showing me that, but the Lord took Ezekiel into the temple and showed him what was happening there, what was defiling the temple. So in similar way, for whatever reason, the armor, the Lord allowed the guard to go down and gave me a bird's eye view of what was happening. And I was just stunned and shocked and bowled over. And basically at 3 a.m. in the morning, I'm saying, we're out of here. I don't care. I'm not doing this film. I'm gone. Now, I'm not being dramatic. That's what I was saying. And what I heard was trust the process. That's what I felt the Holy Spirit tell me. Trust the process. So the next morning I get up, I'm lack of sleep, I'm exhausted, I'm still engaged in spiritual warfare, and I go to meet this historian philosopher, and I'm sitting with him, and we're talking, and we're interviewing, and the cameras are rolling, and I just ask him, I depart from my script sort of, and I say, look, what was here before the Christian era? And he goes, well, before the Christian era, there was ancient goddess worship. It was a matriarchal society based on the goddess Mora. I about fell out of my chair. And as we began to drill in on this, we found out that the goddess Mora would appear, drumroll please, as a serpent. Big surprise there. She would entice the men to love her, and after she was done with them, she would kill them. All of her priests were castrated, and this ancient goddess worship was rife, spread all throughout Portugal. When the Romans came in before the Christian era, there's a temple in the southern part of Portugal, once again erected to the goddess Diana, the huntress, who has often appeared wearing a short skirt. So all that began to add up, and I realized, as Paul tells us in Ephesians 6, our war is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against archons, cosmocrators. And that's what I was up against. I was up against a territorial spirit who did not want this information out. And that's why the visceral spiritual warfare. Well, once we got that, the warfare, kind of backed off, although it was still off and on, hit and miss. It didn't go away completely, but it wasn't like it was that night. It definitely backed off. And what we discovered was, again, this ancient goddess worship. There are still serpent cults that are active in the northern part of Portugal. I'll say it again. In the northern part of Portugal, there are still serpent cults which are active today. So all of this is playing into the discovery. And we interview all these people. We come back. I've got hours and hours and hours of interviews, of film. And, we created Fatima 1, Miracle of a Son of a Harbinger of Deception. And really that film, it just drills in on what put Fatima on the map. And so for those of your audience who don't know about this, the phenomenon went on for 6 months. The children, Lucia, who was 10, Francisco 9, Jacinta 7, are at the tree, and they see this entity, and she says, come back on the 13th next month, and I will visit you again. The kids go and they tell their mother, which tells the parish priest, and the whole becomes an uproar. So on June 13th, there's maybe 100 people that are gathered there waiting for something to happen. Only the children can see the entity. None of the people can. But the people that are gathered there are seeing strange phenomenon in the sky, flying hats, what they call flying hats, weird weather patterns. They're hearing a buzzing noise like the buzzing of bees when the entity begins to speak. So already there's strange phenomena that's happening at the site. Well, July comes and more people are there. And then August. And when August happens, the children are not there. The children have been sequestered by the mayor of the town because it's getting way out of hand. The parish priest, Father Fiera, believes it's demonic. And so they go and they tell the children, look, in September, we want you to go back and ask the entity for a sign. So the kids do that. The kids go back and they ask the entity for a sign, and the entity communicates there'll be a sign on October 13th. The word gets out. Upwards of 70 to 80,000 people are gathered in the field at Fatima. 70 or 80,000 people. It's a lot of people. Remember, most of these people, if not all of these people, had ever seen any aerial phenomenon at all. No airplanes in 1917 in Portugal. Maybe one in Lisbon. Maybe. But most people wouldn't have seen it. Okay? 1917. So 70, 80,000 people are gathered in Fatima. They're waiting for a sign, but no one knows what the sign's going to be. The entity never said what the sign would be. It only said there'll be a sign. So it's been raining all into the early morning. People are sopping wet. There's, in black and white photos taken by the photographer Joshua Benolio, show a sea of black umbrellas that's over the crowd. And for the most part, these are peasants that are there. But there are professional people. There are some doctors, some lawyers. The clergy is there. Politicians are there. The mayor of the town is there. They're all waiting for something to happen. Nothing happens. Finally, it stops raining. The clouds part. The sun comes out. People are still waiting for the apparition, for something to happen, not the apparition. They're just waiting for something to happen. Finally, the children says, here she comes, here she comes. Now, only they could see her. And the entity settles over the tree, and right above the entity, a cloud appears, which a cloud comes in and blocks the sun. And out of the cloud comes a spinning disc-like object. So there's a cloud in front of a sun, and from the cloud emerges a disc-like object which begins to spin and falls. And when it spins, wild colors are going out over the crowd, and it falls like a leaf, and then spins back up again. It does this 3 times before it does what we call the flyby, where it spins and falls down, but then it flies over the heads of the crowd about 100 feet above the air. And this is where and everything that, let me clarify something here. The source material for the entire film project, Fatima 1 and Fatima 2, we only use the handwritten testimonies from the 1917 documents, not 28, not 34, or, further on, because the story changes. As through the years, the story changes. And by the time you get into the 60s, you have a completely different Fatima than what 1917 is saying. And many of the witnesses looked up, and they said on the record, I looked up and saw a dull silver disc. I looked up and saw a disc, which I could see its edge. The word disc, dull silver disc, is used over and over again by the eyewitnesses who were there. And this is the book that we published, José Machado, who is a professor of semiotics in Portugal today. And what he does is he studies film and photographs. That's why he's a professor of semiotics. And he gained access to the Fatima sanctuary a few years back, 2008, I believe. And he was able to handle the original glass plates from 1917, which had been stored in Fatima for the last 100 years essentially. And as a professor of semiotics, he's looking at these glass plates, and he's trying to ascertain what's in them, what's in the photograph. And out of the 12 photographs taken by Joshua Benolio, he says this in the film, there are problems with 4 of them. We were only allowed to show 1. He was only allowed to really show 1. And there was actually 2 in his book, but we drilled down on 1 because the 1 photograph is the game changer. And you can go and that link that you're talking about, and you can see the trailers and see it for yourself. But what he discovers is directly above the apparition site, where the apparition is appearing of the children, directly above it is a round disc-like object. And he goes on the record in the film stating that this object is intrinsic in the glass plate. It's not a smudge, it's not a spot, it's not a chemical burn. Whatever this round object is, it is intrinsic. It's part of the photograph, the original photograph. And he stakes his reputation on that. We published this book called Miracle of the Sun. It's a small little book, but chock with information. And this photograph, we believe, is the smoking gun. It's never been seen before in America. And it's not like, this classic UFO thing. It's not like that. Joshua Benolio is like hundreds of yards away from the apparition site. So even the apparition site appears very, very small in the distance. But directly above it is a round disc-like object. And to me, that's a smoking gun. Because what it does is it corroborates the witnesses' stories that they looked up and saw a dull silver disc. And that's exactly what is stated or what is shown in that photograph. So this happens, and it's mass hysteria. People thought it was the end of the world. And in Fatima 2, the title of that is called Strange Phenomena. And we get into the strange phenomena that accompanied the so-called miracle of the sun. It wasn't the sun that left its place in the universe that day and descended to Earth. It was something else. And we tie this into the whole UFO phenomenon because we know that often UFOs appear out of clouds or disappear into clouds. We actually have a guy that comes on the film in Fatima 2, Mike Adams, who lives in the flight path of airplanes outside Austin, Texas. And he states in the film, there was a commercial airliner, and all of a sudden this guy throttled back and he could hear it, and he looked up to see what was going on, and there was a UFO very close to the plane. And he watched the UFO go into a cloud, and he waited and waited and waited, and the UFO never appeared on the other side of the cloud. So we know that that's what happens. And Mike Adams comes in on the record and just tells us exactly what he saw. Then we have Chase Klotsky, who's a UFO investigator, who I use as a sounding board to relate to the phenomena that happened at Fatima and how it relates to the same phenomena that's happening with UFOs, the buzzing noise that people hear, the skin burns on the skin, the strange substance that falls from the sky when a UFO appears. And there were other phenomena that happened at Fatima, like cars stop working, which happens in modernity. Cars just stop working. Windshields exploded, which happens in modernity. We document all this in the film. Gasoline spontaneously combusted. The hoods of automobiles flew open. So this is not some benevolent, let's all sit around and sing Kumbaya, like it's been, managed with the film that they did in the 50s on Fatima. Hollywood got involved and made this film, and, they treated it as something wondrous and benevolent, and it was Mary of the Bible, according to Catholic sources. Not so fast, citizen. In my opinion, it had nothing to do with Mary of the Bible. What it had to do with is ancient goddess worship with a matriarchal society, which has never, ever left the area. And that's why we talk about the fourth witness, which most people who know about Fatima aren't even aware that there was another girl who I think was 12 at the time. Remember, Lucia was 10, Francisco 9, Jacinta 7, very, very young children. There was a 12-year-old that was out there named Carolina Carriera. And she was the fourth witness. And Fina de Armada discovered her when she was in the Fatima archives and reading the handwritten eyewitness testimonies from 1917. Once again, all of our source material is from the original 1917 documents. And she's reading it and she about falls out of her chair because she realizes, my gosh, someone else had an apparition just a month or two before Lucia and Francisco and Jacinta. So Fina de Armada goes to Fatima and tries to find if she can find her. She finds her. And when I'm interviewing her daughter, Frederica Clara de Armada, in the film, I go, oh my gosh, just like that, because I'm blown away. Because Frederica's saying, and she found her. She found the fourth witness. And I mean, that's just incredible. And that's what kind of a person Fina was. She was boots on the ground, hands on. What is the truth? What are we looking at? She'll go wherever the evidence leads her, but she's looking for the truth, just like Joaquin Fernandez and the rest of the folks that we interviewed, just like myself. So Fina finds her, and she asks her, and this woman tells her of a story. And she's out tending the sheep, just like Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta were. She's out tending the sheep, and above the same tree that the entity would later appear to the three children, she sees underneath the tree, she sees this figure, this childlike figure with long blonde hair. First of all, long blonde hair is incredibly rare in Portugal. You just don't see that, okay? It's just not there. Almost non-existent, okay? It's just not there. And the child that's there is laughing and singing, and Carolina isn't sure whether it's a boy or girl. It's very androgynous, and the hair goes down to the shoulders. And this entity is wearing like a white frock that goes down to the ground. Well, the entity begins to speak to Carolina, but telepathically. So that's red flag number one. And Carolina becomes scared. The entity's saying, come here. Carolina doesn't want to come. She looks at the sheep, and the sheep are startled, looks back at the entity, who keeps beckoning her, calling her, communicating with her telepathically, telling her to come, looks back at the sheep, and they seem to be paralyzed. They're not moving. That's flag number two. She looks back to where the child was, and the child is no longer there. Instead, it is floating above the apparition tree. When I say apparition tree, it's the same tree that the entity that appeared to Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta would appear. It's the same tree. So this child with the long blonde hair and this white smock is floating above the tree. Now, we all know you can't do that. So now this Carolina is totally freaked out, and she leaves the scene. And all this, everything I just described, is brought to life by Wesley Sangiorgi, who does computer-generated imagery, and it's embedded in the film. So while we're talking about this, Wesley brings the story to life, and it's almost like you're there. It's almost like he's got a camera hidden in the bushes. That's how good it is, and it really transports you back into the scene. So there's a fourth witness And later on, Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta, under the same exact tree that Carolina had her encounter, that's where the entity appears to them. So there's high strangeness going on. This is not just some normal thing. And then we went to another site, which is in the film, the site where just the day before, May 13th, another apparition appeared to another shepherd, because that's what they did 100 years ago. I mean, people don't understand what Portugal was like. It was an agrarian economy. The modern age had not kicked in. There was no running water or plumbing in many of the houses. These were small, out-of-the-way little villages, and people lived off the land. It was an agrarian economy. They had sheep and cattle, and they grew their vegetables. And most people were highly uneducated. They were illiterate. They could not read or write. So this entity appears to a shepherd and tells the shepherd that it's Stella Matutina, the same exact name that the mediums use, and all this is in the film. So what we see in Fatima, the miracle of the sun, it was not the sun. It was a disc-like object, analogous to UFOs that we have today, in my opinion. In my opinion, the bottom line is Fatima was a UFO event.
Well, L.A., let me just say this. Ladies and gentlemen, L.A. is offering to our listeners an exclusive for the Paranormal Palaver. You need to understand that you can get all 3 of the Watchmen Chronicles for 50% off. Now look, for $24.95, you will not. You cannot. I'm going to say that with authority. And if Brian disagrees with me, he's free to do so. If you can find better documentation of the issues at hand, and this goes to include the first one, the Watchmen Chronicles, LA does it again. It's in their own words, are UFOs real? He gets boots on the ground. He does the interviews. The second one, Fatima, absolutely off the charts. But this third one is truly holding to my favorite phrase, third time is a charm. It's absolutely off the charts, and LA is not talking out of the side of his head. He literally, on film, shows you all this documentation. It's just off the charts. It is absolutely second to none. I mean, it left Brian and I dumbfounded. I'm like, who came up with the fourth witness? How could you have got a foot? Honestly, ladies and gentlemen, how could you have got pictorial evidence of what occurred in Fatima? You cannot get this anywhere else in English except L.A. Marzulli's work. Now, that being said, this is very nefarious to me because, well, the title of this one is Strange Phenomena, and it is to me strange that everybody thinks this is tied to the biblical Mary. Well, I have umbrage with that. I am well aware of every occurrence in the Bible where an angelic presence made itself known. It did not communicate jawbone to skull. It did not do that. We look at let's just talk about the incident where those were freed from prison. The angel appeared, spoke quite normally, and did everything they could to calm the fears of those being spoken to. That's not what happened at Fatima. I take umbrage with that. When an angel comes, that fear sets in. The angel speaks with his mouth to your physical ear, and he calms your fears. It seems like to me in this instance, this entity was masquerading as an angelic entity, and its intention was to instill fear. L.A., can you speak to that? Can you speak to other occurrences in the Bible, or perhaps other things that you've investigated, where angels go out of their way to speak jawbone to skull, and it's their point to scare you?
Well, anytime we have people in the Bible that actually encounter an angel, they usually wind up doing a face plant. And the angel goes out of its way to restore that person. Think of Daniel. It actually says, I fell on my face. So that's what happens when people encounter an angelic being, because they're holy and they're full of power. God's power, and many of them are right from the throne room. Hello. So, but the angel, the good guys, always are there to help and always lift up, and it's okay. It's okay, like the angel does with Daniel. He speaks into his life and speaks over him. Come on, Daniel, you're gonna be all right. This is something entirely different. This is voice to skull communication. This is telepathic communication, which is exactly what we see again in ufology. It just has got all the hallmarks of a UFO event. And the reason people go, well, what does this have to do with us now, LA? There's a compilation that I put together at the end of Fatima 2, Strange Phenomena. And what it does is it shows apparitions, so-called apparitions, and so-called sun miracles that are happening right now in modernity, in the present day. And what's amazing, in some of these places, you can hear the absolute hysteria of the crowd. 100% through the roof hysteria. People are wailing, crying, moaning, because the sun is pulsing. They see what appears to be a blob of light. They immediately equate the blob of light as Mary. It's not Mary. It's a blob of light. Why are you saying it's Mary? Oh, because don't you see the blue thing on the side? Like the one in 2009 at the Coptic Church in Egypt. Yeah, there's a blue thing on her side, but I don't know what that is. Is it a veil? It has nothing to do with Mary. How do I know? How can you possibly make that leap of logic, that jump across a chasm of clear thinking and call that anything? We have no idea what it is we're looking at. And that compilation that I show, and I show this at conferences, when I show that, and remember, I'm on the stage looking out at the audience faces are stunned. And this is the punchline. The whole interview, what we talked about, leads up to this. And this is why it's so important. Fatima set a precedent which continues into the 21st century, that these so-called sun miracles and apparitions are from God. And in my opinion, they are not. So anytime we have a sun miracle or an apparition, oh, it's from God. Not so fast, citizen. Let's go back to Conyers, Georgia, which I show in the film. That's 1992 to like 97 or 98, whenever it was. Little farm in Conyers, Georgia. And this woman is allegedly seeing apparitions. And pretty soon, thousands of people are gathered there. Well, this one person emailed me, and she was there during one of the so-called sun miracles. And her fiance was standing right next to her. So they're shoulder to shoulder. Get the picture? And she looks up during one of these miracles, so-called miracles, and she sees what she can only refer to as a religious figure. Once again, so that people are looking at it, she sees a religious figure. Her fiance, standing right next to her, looks up at the same phenomenon that's going on. He sees a UFO. He sees a UFO. They're right next to each other, looking at the same phenomenon. She sees a religious figure. He sees a UFO. How is that possible? And this is why, when I heard that, now we go back to the 1917 documents. And by the way, when I got that email, I emailed Joaquin Fernandez and Francisco, the whole crew over there, and said, maybe this is why we're getting what seem to be conflicting reports, but in fact are not. This is why the reports of the phenomena at Portugal during the miracle of the sun, some people look up and see different colored lights in a spinning disc. Other people see a silver disc. It's all over the map. But the word disc, spinning disc, is used over and over and over. Fatima sets the precedent for the modern so-called apparitions and the modern so-called sun miracles, which are, in my opinion, deceiving millions of well-intentioned people. Well, LA, people have conversions and there are miracles and all this stuff. Look, just Satan comes as an angel of light. Satan can perform miracles. We are told that in the latter days, right, Satan will come with all signs and lying wonders. You know, isn't it interesting? In 1917, the Balfour Declaration is being declared in the halls of power in Great Britain, which will later lead to the creation of this modern state of Israel. You don't think the enemy's all over that? Absolutely. Is this a lying wonder? You got to figure it out for yourself. I've done my homework. I've been there. I created 2 films. In my opinion, The Miracle of the Sun was a harbinger of deception, and the strange phenomena could only link back to the fallen cherub, the dragon, Satan, in my opinion.
Well, L.A., we know that there's some historical precedents for aerial phenomena, and obviously describing UFOs with the 1561 celestial phenomenon over Nuremberg. And then a few years later, in 1566, we had one over Basel, when they're clearly describing UFO phenomena. Can you speak to that if you have any background information on those 2 events? Because to me, when you read it, and straight from the newspaper, L.A., they're describing UFOs there. Your thoughts?
Well, these craft have been manifesting in the skies of the world with impunity for thousands of years. The question is, who is behind them? Isn't it interesting that just a few weeks ago, scientists proclaimed that, well, there might not be life in the universe anyway. So, we hear that there's all these planets that might be able to inhabit life, and then scientists do a double take and they sort of step away. Well, not in our immediate galaxy. We don't see anything. So the fact is, and I say this at every conference I've been at in the last year, and I'll say it again, I'll be in Michigan. If you want to see where that is, just go to the blog, lamarzulli.wordpress.com, and it's under Saturday's post, and you can see where I'll be in Michigan. I'm speaking Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday night, Sunday morning, and Sunday night. So lots to talk about. I won't be repeating anything, although there might be some overlap in some of the presentations, but they're all different presentations. So what I've been saying at conferences is this. If we are intellectually honest, and I think I said it last time I was on the show, if we are intellectually honest, no one knows what this is or where we are in it. In other words, no one really knows what the universe is. No one knows how life really got on this planet. Oh, we can speculate till we're blue in the face. The Darwinists say that it just all happened by chance over billions of years. Well, nice thinking. But we all know that the first self-replicating molecule had to have come from somewhere. And we know from our scripture, the biblical prophetic narrative, that the God of the Bible will roll up the universe like a scroll. That's literal, in my opinion. So if the universe is analogous to America, is planet Earth floating in Walla Walla, Duluth, Dallas, Tampa, Los Angeles? We don't know. We have no idea of what this is. We have no idea of where we are in it. So the idea of, you mentioned Nuremberg and the battle that was above the skies. I mean, now there's a lithograph that shows that. They saw it as Battle of Heaven. There's also when Jerusalem, right before Titus came in, the skies opened up according to the rabbinical tradition. I think Josephus talks about it and talks about that the people of Jerusalem saw this war going on in the heavens above them. Look, we are at war. There's no doubt about it. We know that Michael and his angels fight with Satan and his angels, and Satan is thrown out of his place in heaven. Woe to the inhabitants on earth, because the devil, the dragon, has come to earth, and he's really ticked off. I'm paraphrasing here, because he knows his time is short. And now he's stuck in our space-time continuum, whereas before he had the ability to flip interdimensionally. Now he no longer does when he's cast down. That's future. So we're in a very interesting period of time. And there's one clip I show in the film. It's from Nigeria. And you can actually see the sky like splitting open, and this brilliant light is pouring through. And in the midst of the light, there's like a figure standing there. And of course, everybody immediately figures it's got to be Jesus. Why? Because it looks like pictures we've all seen since we were kids. I have no idea who that figure is. If someone knocks on your door at 2 o'clock in the morning, dressed like Jesus, and even looks like Jesus, are you going to let him in? Heck no. Who are you? Well, I'm Jesus. Show me. End of story. I mean, are you kidding me, right? And why would Jesus have to knock on the door anyway, right? Especially in a Christian home. But you get what I'm saying. Just because someone shows up and looks like this apparition in Nigeria that looks like Jesus, it's just a blob of light with some coloring that makes it look like it's wearing robes. The hysteria in the crowd is off the charts. One guy's going, thank you, Lord. I mean, people are drinking the Kool-Aid. No one is rebuking first and asking questions later. No one is testing the spirits. Nobody is. They're all just accepting it. It must be from God. Just like in the 2009 clip that I show in the film from the Coptic Church in Egypt. Muslims and Christians are together. They're clapping and they're celebrating the apparition. And when these apparitions occur, and this gets back into ancient Babylon mystery schools, Mary is always this blob of light, and she's always holding the smaller blob of light, the baby Jesus. First of all, that's blasphemous, absolutely blasphemous, because Jesus is not a baby. And why would he appear that way? Why would he allow himself to appear as a baby in his mother's arms again? I mean, that's just absolute nonsense. But that's what it is, and people immediately assume because, there's Mary and the baby Jesus. No, there's no more baby Jesus. Baby Jesus is the risen Savior of the world, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, sitting at the right hand of the Father, interceding at this moment for you and for me. That's who Jesus is. And you know what? I think his white horse is getting ready to be mounted. That's what I think. So this whole thing appeals to a false spirituality, in my opinion. And that's what's dangerous about it.
Well, L.A., unfortunately, I think Brian and I would definitely agree with you. And let's get Brian's comments on this matter. Brian, you have hit the history books. Should we be aware of other instances where other religions worshipped flying disc? Was this ever good? And all the listeners know that Brian has had more than one, encounters himself. Brian, can you speak to the history of the involvement with flying disc? Are they good? And is what happened with the occurrences there in Portugal, where this entity, I'm not going to call it angelic, although that's obviously what it was masquerading as, was an angelic entity. In your encounter, how would an angel act? I mean, it seems to me that both I and L.A. agree that an angel always shows up and comforts you and does not speak into your skull. It speaks normally. So 2 points there, Brian. The flying disc phenomena in history with other religions, and throw your 2 cents in there about the ancient worship of the feminine, which, I'm sorry, it's just, you have to take it at face value, what L.A. documents here, that there's something going on with this feminine worship. So, Brian, your comments, please.
Well, the flying disc thing gets rather interesting. Now, I've been going back through trying to understand why is it that when you have this certain mystery schools come along in the late 1800s going into the 1900s, and they make a proclamation that it's going to be the age of Horus, and in the midst of this, all of a sudden on top of it as well, they're trying to conjure the harlot of Babylon at the same time. So I go back and I take a look at the story concerning Horus, for instance, and ironically enough, because they speak of this is going to be a time of great bloodshed and all of these other just horrendous things are going to be taking place on the planet, which we can clearly see has definitely happened since we moved forward with World War I, World War II, and then continuing forward with this nonstop chaos that just does not seem to end. I want to know why this is happening. And you see this description with one of these battles that takes place with Horus, actually a couple of them, where he goes up and his appearance is a flying disc with the wings on the side. And I'm going, okay, that's a little bit peculiar, all considering everything we've been seeing happen over the course of these last 50, 60 odd years here going on within the modern concept of everything. But to break this around to this feminine worship, and this is where things start to get a little bit odd. There's been a stretch of things that I've been looking at here as far as a lot of the archaeological data that has turned up in the archaeogenetic data stream that has started coming in over the course of the last 10 or so years, that they started locking down specifically people that were coming out of Central Asia going up into the Balkans and into the rest of the European continents. And what they found there is two sets of data where they find out one group is later, whereas the other one is obviously the previous group, and they were all tied in with matriarchal worship. And, in the midst of the discussion I was having last week, I was asked the question, well, how do you tell which one is pre-flood and which one is post-flood? And this is something I considered when I saw this lecture that was just released in the last few months here. One of the famous archaeologists in Britain, and he brings up that this first culture was matriarchal. And I kind of had to sit back and ask myself, looking at all the iconography, all the different statues and everything that's going on there, could we be dealing with the pre-flood society that was happening here? And the more and more and more you begin to dig away at this data that they're bringing forward, you start getting that impression that that's exactly what is happening. Now, when we flip things forward, when we come to 1945, this is when they find the Nag Hammadi Gnostic Gospels. And you start finding out there's very disturbing things going on within the context of what's being stated with these Gnostic texts. And as we all know, the early church was fighting against these very heresies. And when you understand the context of it, you start to see why. Their big thing that they keep talking about is Sophia. And, of course, they tie this into being wisdom, and it keeps building in that direction. And there's just so many other parallels that keep tying into this. But, another thing that I've come across as I'm looking at these parallels that are going into the late 1800s, going up into the mid 1900s with the different occult movements that were going there as well. It turns out that you have, within these specific texts, if you go back to John Dee's Enochian Magic, which once again, what happened there? Well, he channeled this set of writings, which he claimed to be from angels, but the more you look at it, you find out that these spirits are committing blasphemy on a continual basis to the point of just utter ridiculousness, not to even mention it's wrapped up in all kinds of apocalyptic connotations. And it just keeps building. But the strangest thing about this is that you find out that you have several names within those texts that come directly from these Nag Hammadi Gnostic texts. And I find it very peculiar that somehow those ended up in this equation when those texts had not been found yet. Now, there's been some other stuff that I was looking at here today that even further amplifies this sort of strange connection with, for instance, there's been a lot of findings out in Romania in that area where they have found these connections with the giants and the matriarchal societies that are prominent with the goddess worship. But this is something we've talked about privately, and it's that term in the Bible that's usually rendered as screech owl, or even like the NASB will call it night monster, with Lilith, which the screech owl and Lilith go hand in hand with one another. Now, what disturbed me the most is they took, because we know we have in Australia, for instance, the people there have this these images where they think these things are greys. And it turns out that these are owls that are showing up in all these different cultures that we have actually thought they were greys the entire time. And it just, I keep looking more and more and more at this, and every time I keep digging deeper into trying to get to the bottom of what's happening here, you keep coming back to somehow that this goddess worship is tied in with everything that seems to be going on within the UFO area. And I don't see that this is coincidence any longer when all these roads keep pointing to the same places on a continual basis.
Well, I absolutely agree, but I had no idea that you were going to bring in the aspect of the giants and the Nephilim being connected to goddess worship as well. That takes this to a whole nother level. Let's get LA back on here. for his closing comments and thoughts, but we're not done with him quite yet because I want to ask him about something else. So, L.A., your closing comments on the Fatima documentary and what Brian had to add about the historical references to exactly what you declare in this documentary, Fatima 2.
Well, Brian's overview was really expertly put forth, and I thank him for that. What we see is an explosion of occult literature and occult underpinnings, which really manifests like crazy at the beginning or the latter part of the 18th century or the 19th century into the 20th. I mean, that's what really, you got Blavatsky and the Thule Society and, all the stuff all throughout Europe, the Hellfire Society in England. I mean, you got some really crazy stuff going on, really crazy stuff going on. And, by the time you get to the 20th century, and of course, in the 19th century, you got Darwinism, which says, there really is no God, no supernatural. And so a lot of this stuff, and like Helena Blavatsky and like who I mentioned, but it really starts taking off. The world of the occult just starts flying towards mid to end 19th century, and then it really manifests, of course, in the 20th. Adolf Hitler was an occult adept, as were many high-ranking Nazis. The Black Sun, what happened at the castle, which Russ Disdor, my friend and colleague, went to a number of years ago, and Wedelburg Castle, where the Hall of the Dead underneath and the skulls were placed there. I mean, all this ritualistic nonsense that was done. They knew who they were in league with. They absolutely knew who they were in league with. So what we get with Fatima is not this, Nazi-like occult manifestation that we have, let's say, with the Third Reich, with the Black Sun. We get something completely different. We get ancient goddess worship. And this entity is masquerading as the sacred feminine. And what I have, as you said earlier, what I take umbrage with is that people lap this stuff up and they think it's Mary of the Bible. And I've been in dialogue with people that hold to that position. But if we're going to look at Scripture and Scripture only, sola scriptura, and not go off the reservation, as it were, Mary fades from the scene in the book of Acts. Now, there are people that insist that the woman clothed with the 12 stars on her feet, clothed with the sun and the 12 stars under her feet, some of that's Mary. Well, most biblical scholars look at that, and that's Israel, and the 12 stars under her feet are the tribes of Israel. So it's a completely different interpretation. Mary fades from Scripture right after the book of Acts. She's no longer there. She doesn't write anything that we know about anyway, although it would be interesting to see if something would a hidden manuscript would come to light in the present day. I believe that her testimony is found in the book of Luke, because there's some things in Luke and other Gospels where the only person who would know would be Mary. Like when Jesus is presented in the temple 8 days after he's birthed. Well, how's or whatever after he's birthed? There's no one there scribing that. So Luke, I think, is talking to Mary about that. Same thing with the genealogy. Mary's looking at all this, and who knows what's happening. So that's why we took Mary off the table, because that subject is sacrosanct to many, many people. And so we don't even talk about it. We don't drill down on bashing, the idea of Mary worship and all this stuff. We don't even go there. We just go to the evidence from a 1917 film. We look at what the evidence says. I'm sorry, not film, the 1917 documents. We look at that, and that's what we relate in the film. And in my opinion, all the evidence points to this was the miracle of the sun was, and all the strange phenomena that went with it. The miracle of the sun and all the strange phenomena that went with it was a harbinger of deception, which is carried right through into modernity, into the present day. And I find that incredibly alarming. So, up on your site, Matthew, you've got that private link. It's an exclusive. It's only for your listeners. And basically it's 50% off on all 3 films. UFOs Are Real, Fatima 1 and Fatima 2. It's a great deal. and it's hours and hours of watching. And look, I've talked to people. A lawyer emailed me today and said, "L.A. Fatima 2 was just eye-opening, excellent work." So, and I think Matthew, without putting words in his mouth, basically is corroborating what the lawyer said. So we know we hit pay dirt with the Fatima films, and Fatima 2 is by far, it just kind of brings it all together. That this was a UFO event, that it's a harbinger of deception, and that we're to test the spirits. If Mary wants to show up in my, on my property at 2 a.m. and talk to me, you better believe I'm going to test the spirits. And the way you test the spirits is, did Jesus come in the flesh? That's what you ask. Nothing else. Did Jesus come in the flesh? And the reason why that drives them nuts, the imposters, and they don't like to say yes, but because that spelled their doom. That spells defeat of the dragon and the dragon system. Calvary did it. So when Jesus came in the flesh, that's what filled the prophecy in Genesis 3:15. When Jesus came in the flesh, that was the one who crushed the serpent's head. And they don't want to admit that. So that's why John admonishes us. How do you test the spirits? Did Jesus come in the flesh? And you'll find out that if you're talking to a demon or an imposter, they don't like that question, which is why we're meant to ask it. What we're supposed to do is to rebuke first and ask questions later with a simple statement like, "Father, if this is not from you, shut it down in the name of Jesus." And he will shut it down. Bring your angels and shut it down, Lord. I don't know what I'm looking at. Shut it down. And, we've seen things in the sky, and when we do, we're not sure. We immediately rebuke first, ask questions later.
Well, L.A., I do have one other thing to ask you about. It's come to my attention via your documentary on the infamous shroud. It would appear that archaeology has come forth with evidence that in the Promised Land, they have found a skull that had coins in its eyes. Now, I remember back when you released that documentary, I had questions about that. The shroud perhaps depicting coins on the eyes. But now we have proof that your documentary needs to be viewed again. So why don't you give the listeners a refresher course on your work you've did on the shroud, please?
That's part of, I believe it's either Watchers 2 or Watchers 3. I forget which one, but the Shroud of Turin, and you can get that at lamarzulli.net, lamarzulli.net, or you can buy the entire set, the Best of Watchers, and that's a great deal, because each one standalone is $20. So if you buy all 10, it's like $99.99 or whatever. So it's a much better deal. But we talked to two people that examined the shroud up close. One was the Right Honorable Barry Schwartz, who was the photographer on the original 1978 Shroud of Turin Research Project team, who, out of the 200 hours that they were allowed to view the shroud, basically took photos for about 110 of them. So to give you an idea, he was completely committed to what he was assigned to do. And then we have Dame Isabel Pixek, who is a particle physicist and also a muralist, and some of her works hangs in museums all across the planet and even the Vatican. So she's incredibly erudite, brilliant woman. And she was the one that came up after examining the shroud with the idea of an event horizon, that the shroud actually shows the frontal and the dorsal image of a crucified man in rigor mortis. The hands are over the private areas, and the body has been scourged unmercifully. The beating is particularly savage, and the only place that it's not scourged is right above the heart. And the Roman executioners knew that if they scourged him above the heart, they'd kill the guy. It's absolutely brutal. And he's wearing a helmet of thorns, not a crown. It's more of a helmet, like a hat that's put on him. Very long hair. The beard is bifurcated. The eyes are closed, and because of the photo imagery that they're able to do, it appears that two coins, which are widow mites, by the way, from the first century, are above the eyes. The nail prints are not in the palm of the hands. They're in the wrist of the hands, because you can't hang a man from a cross putting a nail in the wrist or in the palms. You run it through. If you open your palm right where it connects, right above the lines in your wrist, that, and you angle the nail at an angle, and it goes through without breaking the bone, and that's how you hang a man from a cross. It's just brutal. I call the Shroud of Turin God's calling card. It's on a herringbone weave of linen, which shows a crucified man, the frontal and dorsal image. And what Dame Isabel came up with is this event horizon. The body, in her opinion, this is how the shroud was produced. The body was levitated in the tomb. All time stopped, gravity stopped, everything stopped. The world stopped. Time stopped as we know it. And that body was bifurcated. In other words, it evaporated. It disintegrated in millions of points of light, all simultaneously. And that's why you get a frontal and a dorsal image of the shroud. And that's Dame Isabel Pixick's work, which is just absolutely incredible. And in my opinion, it's God's calling card. That's what I've called it for years, and will continue to call it God's calling card. By the way, the original carbon-14 dating of the shroud was proven to have been manipulated. And they realized that there were fibers in that carbon-14 dating test sample from the 15th century reweaving, the repairing of the shroud by the Poor Sisters of Clare, which skewed the data. And that's another topic for another time. But in my opinion, and that's since been proven that the data was skewed. And of course, this German lady went in and steam cleaned the shroud and stretched it, thereby removing any forensic evidence for any other future examination. That was deliberate, in my opinion. And that's God's calling card, and they've ruined it. But we've got the 1978 STIRP, Shroud of Turin Research Project team, and that evidence and that data is voluminous. If you want to know more about the shroud, go to shroud.com. I'm pretty sure it's .com. It might be .org, but I'm pretty sure it's .com. That's by Barry Schwartz, and you can spend hours there.
All right, L.A., thank you for bringing us up to speed, reminding us about your work you've done on the shroud. I strongly suggest that you look into getting that work of L.A.'s as well. Brian, your closing comments, please, before we get L.A. to say goodbye.
I don't know that I really have too much to say, a lot to listen to. That documentary was just amazing as far as Fatima is concerned, and I just really was pleased with how professional the investigation was, because, I mean, in this day and age, we seem to be getting a lot of people that are going out and investigating these things, and they don't really seem to bring any kind of solid, concrete evidence forward. They bring a bunch of what ifs, but that documentary just blew me away with how thoroughly professional it was and just how thorough it was.
Amen to that. Amen to that. I was completely stunned. So, L.A., please come on, and don't forget to remind everybody of your website, but also your PPS report that, ladies and gentlemen, I watch routinely. Tell everybody where they can find you. I know you do Acceleration Radio, too. It's on a different format now, but you need to let everybody know where you're at and where they can find you.
Well, the easiest place to find me is lamarzulli.net. You can get every place from that, and we're in the process of revamping the website. We'll probably have something by summer's end, hopefully. But I'm on YouTube, L.A. Marzulli, and YouTube subscribers are hovering around 85,000, so subscribe. And I do 2 shows a week, Acceleration Radio on Tuesday night, which is a live radio show. But I do it in my studio, and the cameras are rolling. And then the next day, we post a video up on YouTube. And then on Thursday or Friday, I'll shoot Politics, Prophecy, and the Supernatural PPS report. Same thing. That's posted usually Friday or Saturday. So 2 shows a week, and lots of updates, lots of guests, lots of good stuff. So that's how to find me. And thanks, guys, for having me on the show. Really appreciate the kind words. And, you know, folks, again, Matthew and Brian have a special on their site. It's only for them, and you have to go to that link and check it, and it's 50% off. So it's a great deal.
It's an excellent, great deal, and quite a gift that he's offering to our listeners. So, ladies and gentlemen, L.A., of course, failed to remind you that he also has a newsletter that is for purchase on his website. I think it's a couple of bucks or $3 a month, but I strongly suggest that you get that.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah, that's PPS report.
Okay, that is the PPS report. Definitely. You can also support LA just out of the goodness of your heart. He's extensively traveling. His wife goes along with him, and they certainly need your prayer cover. So you need to go to his website and look for his schedule. And while he's in transit, you need to offer him prayer cover because he's on the front lines, ladies and gentlemen. He's on the front lines. Him and his wife are literally putting their head on the chopping block in the realm of spiritual warfare. So, ladies and gentlemen, please remember L.A. and his wife in your prayers. And until next time, this is a Paranormal Palaver signing off.